One of the biggest debates within Christianity right now revolves around the sacrament of the Eucharist. People have fought and fought over questions about transubstantiation, consubstantiation, and whether or not certain graces are conferred during communion. Sacramentalists use John 6 commonly to argue that communion is a sacrament. And when I use the word sacrament or sacramental, I will be referring to any ritual that confers grace, allegedly or not. Maybe you've been in a discussion on John 6, and so you should know that it's often a very stirring subject, and that's for good reason, because each side of the debate would agree that the other side is not experiencing the fullness of Christianity. And since no Christian in his right mind would doubt that God's graces are important for Christian life, we must determine the real meaning of John 6. And I think it's safe to say that any Protestant, Catholic, evangelical, or Orthodox Christian, among others, are failing in their duties as Christians if they purposely don't research this topic. We are dealing with one of the most important doctrines when we read John 6, so we had better get it right. For starters, I'd like to divide the Bread of Life discourse into three different sections, but that's just for the sake of organization, and I address each section differently as well, although I won't be discussing the third section in this video. Now, obviously, the entire passage should be read in its context, but this is how I group the text for study. The first section I group because it introduces the discourse, and for sake of argument, its language is not quite as Eucharistic as that of verses 51 through 58. In fact, some Catholic theologians, for example, will say that verses 1 through 48 in this chapter of John can be taken symbolically. Next, I group verses 51 through 58 together because it's a common location that sacramentalists will cite. And lastly, I put verses 59 to the end of the passage by themselves because they are not very commonly cited yet are still part of the debate somewhat. Now, before I actually show what arguments I'll be posing against the sacramentalist interpretation, I did want to list some arguments I find especially weak and a sort of distraction from genuine progress. But I will say that these points do have their merits sometimes when used properly, and I can make a video at another time explaining why I find these arguments not very strong. We'll just take as an example of a weak argument the argument that non-sacramentalists are somehow wrong because they break their own rule of literal interpretation to make John 6 metaphorical. This argument goes that literalists will contradict themselves since they interpret John 6 metaphorically instead of literally. Yet literalists will in fact refer to the other metaphors in John, such as I am the door and I am the vine, to support their interpretation of John 6. So clearly, literalists believe in metaphors, and literal interpretation does allow for metaphors as well. Now, starting from the top, my first point against the sacramentalist interpretation lies in verse 35, which states, Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me will not hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst. Second, I'll discuss a fundamental and extremely significant difference between the words in the synoptics, this bread is my body, and the words in John 6, I am the bread. Next, I'll argue by contrasting verse 47 with verses 53 through 54, and lastly, I'll bring up an internal issue with the sacramentalist interpretation, which doesn't necessarily refute the interpretation itself, but it does make it unacceptable to the sacramentalist view. So let's move on to verse 35. Briefly, I'll make the point that coming to Jesus is a figure for believing in him. We know this because in John 5:40, Jesus says that those who come to him will have eternal life, and in other passages, Jesus says that whoever believes in him will have eternal life, so we know that these phrases are one and the same. Anyway, here in verse 35, we have what I believe is a detrimental problem for sacramentalism. Without involving myself in a hard-to-follow argument, I'll simply state that Jesus was very clear. If you believe in him, and go ahead and ask yourself if you do, you should easily say yes, then you won't ever hunger or thirst. Now what does that mean? It means you'll never hunger or thirst, no, not ever. And how long does never last? It lasts forever, guys. But according to the Sacramentalist view, the Eucharist is allegedly the food which satisfies spiritual hunger in John 6. But again, how can this be the case when verse 35 makes clear that belief is the way to satisfy hunger forever? None of these later verses past John 6:35 could therefore be saying that communion satisfies hunger in this sense, because Jesus already said that belief does. Now, some will object to this point by saying that it's a false dichotomy, that belief is or that verse 35 is kind of really the same as the later discussion in verses 51 through 58, so they object by saying that the phrase, "He who comes to me will not hunger, and he who believes in me will never thirst," really just previews the fuller discussion about the Eucharist, which will follow in verses 51 through 58. The problem is, Jesus never said that he was previewing or hinted at that, but more importantly, the language of the verse itself determines that it cannot be a preview, because there's a clear cause and effect structure in the verse that cannot be weakened to some kind of preview-like statement. Now, according to the verse, if you believe, you will never hunger or thirst. So how then does communion satisfy hunger and thirst if those are already forever satisfied by faith? And the last objection states that in the relevant literature of the time, in Jesus' days, eating flesh and drinking blood were metaphors for injuring another person rather than believing in another person. So the idea that eating flesh and drinking blood are metaphors for faith is wrong, according to this objection. But I think it's good enough for me to say that there is no rule, written or unwritten, in the Bible or in oral or written tradition that forbids Jesus from using figurative language, such as this, in his own way. And I don't feel the need to press that point any further, since weak arguments require only weak objections. This argument is really based on an unproven rule, and as such, it is equally unproven and invalid. Okay, so in the Synoptics and 1 Corinthians, the biblical authors record Jesus' words, "This bread is my body." On the other hand, in John 6, Jesus says, "I am the bread." I submit to you that these words from John 6 are actually fundamentally different from the words in the Synoptics and 1 Corinthians, and if these words did truly refer to communion, they would contradict sacramentalist theology anyway. But before I get any further, I need to talk about what accidents and substance are in sacramental theology. The accidents of an object for our purposes can be a certain characteristic about that object that doesn't change the substance of it. I know that's confusing, but think about this. A person who becomes tan has not changed in substance. He would still be the same person and the same substance, but he has changed in accidents. Since he used to be whiter, now he's more tan. Substance, on the other hand, is an object's essential makeup. So if that man stood next to one of his friends, not only would they be totally different in accidents, but they would be different in substance too, since they're two different people and two different substances. With that being said, let's continue. First, assuming that these words really were about the Eucharist, "I am the bread of life," okay, it refers to the Eucharist, we still have a serious problem, because it is actually theologically inaccurate for Jesus to make this statement, according to sacramental theology. Time and time again, sacramentalists will assert that after consecration, what was previously bread is truly and substantially no longer bread. In other words, they don't call the Eucharist bread, they call it Jesus, among other names such as the Eucharistic elements and whatnot. So when Jesus says that he is the bread, it doesn't actually fit with sacramental theology whatsoever. In fact, it contradicts it severely. And this is not a minor point at all, because if we wanted to take Jesus literally in John 6, as sacramentalists claim to do, then we would say that Jesus is truly and substantially a piece of bread. And obviously that doesn't work. Now, there is a way that can solve this issue, but it requires what I believe is an interpretive leap, and it carries its problems anyway. If Jesus only meant that he is bread and accidents and not substance, then verse 35 may indeed work for sacramentalists. Here again, there are problems. To begin with, why should we adopt this view? I don't see reason to adopt this view, and in fact, I see reasons not to. First, when Jesus said, "This bread is my body," I am told that Jesus really meant that the bread changes substances. But when Jesus says, "I am bread," I am told that Jesus does not change substances at all, he only changes in accidents. And so why this selective interpretation? I found no answer for this kind of double standard hermeneutic, and it poses a serious problem for the sacramentalist view. And second, even if Jesus meant that he is bread and accidents, we still have another serious issue because the bread is not there. Where is the bread? Jesus did not use a future tense such as "I will be the bread." He said, "I am the bread." That's present tense at that moment. Now, if Jesus claimed to be bread at that moment, where is the bread? Could Jesus have been the Eucharistic bread without there being any bread present? No, absolutely not. In its proper definition, a Eucharistic bread must be under the appearance of bread, and there is no such thing as a Eucharist without its elements. Otherwise, that Eucharist would just be normal Jesus. And that's the case in John 6, because in John 6, Jesus was present without the Eucharistic elements, and therefore he was just Jesus. Thus, he could not have been referring to the Eucharist, and John 6:35 and similar verses in John 6 cannot be about communion. So moving on now to verses 51 through 58, I'd like to set verses 47 and 53 through 54 side by side. This argument, you might say, is similar to the argument I made in verse 35, but I think it's actually more forceful. Here we have the heart of the message of life in verse 47. He who believes in me has eternal life. That's a clear and simple statement. The cause is belief and the effect is possessing eternal life. Now, it might seem like a waste of time for me to say this, but when Jesus says whoever believes in him has eternal life, it's the same as saying whoever believes in him will live forever. There is no meaningful difference. You can read John 11:25 through 26 to see this, and another passage that I'll show later. I say all this because I found that some people think of eternal life as a sort of object that you can spiritually hold and give back, which is not true. It's a state, not an object. Anyway, in verse 47, Jesus means that whoever believes in him will live forever. And now we have a major problem. If verses 53 through 54 refer to communion, then Jesus just contradicted himself. Allegedly, Jesus said in verse 54 that unless you receive the Eucharist, you cannot have eternal life, period. But wait, Jesus says you get eternal life by faith, and faith can and should precede one's first communion. So, what is it? Do we receive eternal life by faith or communion? And believing in Jesus is not the same as receiving communion, as some might argue, nor necessarily a proof of which. And since both options can't be true, and Jesus first and more clearly said that whoever believes in him has eternal life, I cannot accept the sacramentalist view. Okay, guys, this will be my last point. But on a side note, you're probably wondering why this video is as long as it is if this is my last point. Well, surprise, surprise, we're going to talk about the Greek present tense after this. But anyway, assuming again that these verses do in fact refer to communion, we run into another major practical issue for sacramentalists. Jesus said, whoever eats of the bread has eternal life. That is, he will live forever. If you didn't believe me the first time I said that the phrase eternal life is equivalent to lives forever, then read verses 54 and 58 and we'll show you that they're one and the same. And so why is this an issue? It's an issue because it teaches that communion only needs to be received once, and the communicant will live forever. He has what theologians call eternal security. According to the passage, if you eat the bread, yes, even once, then you'll live forever. That's what Jesus said. Now, guys, forever means forever, but sacramentalists, on the other hand, don't believe that one communion guarantees heaven, even though Jesus would be teaching that here. Depending on the sect of Christianity, some sacramentalists might believe you have to take communion once a year as a minimum or more. So at this point, I pretty much have to discuss the Greek present tense, because I'll bet that some people object to some of my points by alluding to it. Yet at the same time, I'm not going to act like I could cover all the points of Greek verbal grammar, because I absolutely cannot, and I'm not a grammarian either, but I can read. But anyway, what I hear all the time is this: a present tense verb in Greek means that the action is continuous, always and automatically. But viewers, this charge against the non-sacramentalist view and this claim on Greek grammar overall is very wrong and thankfully burning out in some popular theology circles. Now, for starters, Greek is not English, so we can't blithely apply English grammar rules to Greek. But English has an instantaneous present tense anyway. Not all of its present tenses are continuous. One example of this would be he trips on the log. And whoever that unfortunate man was who tripped on the log, he certainly wasn't tripping on that log perpetually till the end of his life. And furthermore, the Greek present tense is much more dynamic than some writers truly appreciate. While the continuous present tense does exist, it's only one aspect of the present tense category. There are more aspects and more types. There are futuristic presence, for example, historical presence, instantaneous presence, conative presence, repeated presence, and more. So let me make it clear, guys. A present tense in Greek is not automatically continuous in aspect, but it can be. And a present tense verb does not have to be in the indicative mood to be instantaneous either, as I'll show in a bit. It can be in a participle mood. With that stated, let's actually talk about participles now. A participle is simply a word that has the qualities of a verb and an adjective. We have them in English too. For example, this sentence, he is a working man. Working can be a normal verb, but here it functions as an adjective. In John 6, the phrases he who believes, he who eats, and he who drinks are all participle constructions in Greek. And this is going to be important, as you'll see later. But to preserve the participle during translation into English, we could translate these as the believing one, the eating one, and the drinking one. The full name for these participles, the full name for these constructions is present articular substantival participle constructions. I know, crazy. Anyway, keep in mind that this truth is not a matter of me having a different Bible from you. This is just the Greek. And all manuscripts of John 6, to my knowledge, use the same words here that we're talking about. And also note that I think that the normal way of translating the Greek is perfectly fine. It just doesn't retain the participle in English. So what's the big deal about participle constructions in Greek? Let's find out. In John 27:3, it's written that when Judas, who had betrayed him, that is Jesus, saw that he had been condemned, he felt remorse and returned the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and elders. So let's focus on the phrase Judas, who had betrayed him. Again, in Greek, the words who had betrayed him are a present participle construction. And in context, this betrayal was when Judas gave Jesus over to the crowd sent from the priests and elders in Matthew 26, and obviously that was an instantaneous event, not something that Judas did continuously or perpetually till the end of his life. And this is a present articular substantival participle construction, remember. And also, the present participle here, and I'll emphasize the present part of that, is translated into the English past perfect tense, which I think is interesting and shows you how dynamic Greek is. Lastly, it's well noted that these participle constructions often function as verbal nouns, and guess what? Nouns don't tell you how long an action occurs, basically. So therefore, we might call the verbs under discussion nomic verbs or instantaneous verbs, depending on how you look at it. Thus, the present tenses in John 6 are not likely continuous, but ultimately a word's context and its modifiers tell us whether it is instantaneous or continuous. So let's look at the Greek word which means to die. Normally people only die once, right? So the verb is normally instantaneous even in the present tense. However, in 1 Corinthians 15:31, Paul wrote, I die daily. And there the preposition daily in Greek changes the meaning of the verb die. It changes it from instantaneous to continuous, or really repeated. So we know that it's continuous because of its modifier. In regard to John 6, we have all the indications that the verbs we're discussing are instantaneous. The bread of life discourse started when the people wanted more physical, perishable bread from Jesus, and he told them that they should instead labor for the food that endures forever. That is, they won't have to eat it again. So, throughout the discourse, Jesus juxtaposed the temporal nature of this physical bread against the eternal nature of his supernatural bread. In verse 35, Jesus said that the eater of this sustenance will never, never hunger again. So that means the bread only needs to be eaten once. With that being said, there is no reason to argue that the present tenses in John 6 are continuous. To recap, I argued that the sacramentalist view of John 6 does not hold water for several good and valid reasons. In verse 35, Jesus makes clear that belief is the theme of the passage. The words I am bread don't refer to communion, and even if they did, contradict sacramentalist theology anyway, as I showed. And putting verse 47 with verses 53 through 54, I showed that the section of 51 through 58 doesn't refer to the Eucharist either. And lastly, even if these verses did refer to the Eucharist, they'd still support eternal security, but in a different way. Anyhow, I'm always open to correction and direction, and I hope I didn't ruffle feathers too horribly. I just thought I'd make this video because I think the points that I bring are valid, somewhat novel, and mostly unsolved by sacramentalists, so please think about these things. I hope you enjoyed the video, and thank you very much for watching.